Welcome, wanderers of Tamriel, and welcome to those seeking respite from their daily journey. I invite you to make yourself comfortable as the crackling flames of our hearth keep the night at bay. Tonight we begin a new chronicle, tales of an empire on the brink of Daedric princes and mortal heroes of sacrifice and salvation. This is the first chapter in our exploration of the Elder Scrolls, Oblivion Remastered Lore, a world rich with history, intrigue, and destiny. As the fireplace casts its warm glow across the room, allow yourself to be transported to the heart of Tamriel, to the Imperial province of Cyrodiil, where our story begins. In the hours ahead, we will witness the collapse of an empire that has stood for centuries, and the desperate struggle to prevent a cataclysm that threatens not just the realm of mortals, but the very fabric of reality itself. So close your eyes, if you wish, or let them drift with the dancing flames, as we begin our journey through the Elder Scrolls lore, a journey perfect for these quiet hours, as day turns to night, and consciousness gives way to dreams. Chapter 1. The Empire of Tamriel. Long before the Oblivion crisis threatened to consume all of Nirn, the Empire of Tamriel stood as a monument to mortal ambition and determination. To understand the magnitude of what was at stake during the Oblivion crisis, we must first understand what the Empire was and how it came to be. The story of the Empire is, in many ways, the story of the Septim dynasty, founded by Tiber Septim, the man who would later ascend to godhood. As Telos, the empire unified the disparate provinces of Tamriel under a single banner through both conquest and diplomacy. In the year 2I-8096, after decades of campaign, Tiber Septim finally achieved what many thought impossible, the complete unification of Tamriel. With the Numidium, a powerful Duma construct at his disposal, he brought even the ancient homeland of the High Elves, the Somerset Isles, under imperial control. This moment marked the end of the Second Era and the beginning of the Third, a new age of relative peace and prosperity under the guidance of the Septim Emperors. For over 400 years, the Septim bloodline would rule from the imperial city, maintaining order across the continent with varying degrees of success. At the heart of the empire lay Cyrodiil, the imperial province, a land of rolling hills, dense forests, and sprawling plains. The province is divided into several counties, each with its own unique character and challenges. In the northeast stands Chudenhar, a city of Dunmerry, influence nestled against the Vallis Mountains. To the southeast, the port city of Luawen sits at the mouth of the Nibun River, perpetually threatened by the swampy expanse of Black Marsh beyond its walls. Bravo, often considered the least prosperous of Cyrodiil's cities, clings to the banks of the Nibun Bay, its weathered structures a testament to hardship and perseverance. The western half of the province presents a stark contrast to the east. Skrengrad's vineyards produce the finest wines in all of Tamriel, while Kovach perches atop a plateau, its walls offering a commanding view of the Gold Coast. Anvil serves as the empire's western port, opening trade routes to High Rock and Hammerfell, and in the cold north, Bruma stands as a bastion of Nordic culture within Cyrodiil's borders, its people as hardy as the snow-covered landscape they call home. But it is the imperial city itself that truly captures the essence of the empire's grandeur, built upon a natural island in the heart of Lake Romeray. The city's architecture is dominated by the White Gold Tower, an ancient eyelid structure that predates even the empire itself. It is from this tower that the emperor rules, surrounded by the Elder Council and protected by the Imperial Legion and the secretive Blades. The empire's structure extends beyond mere geography. The Elder Council, composed of representatives from noble families across Tamriel, serves as both advisory body and legislative authority. The Imperial Legion maintains order and defends the Empire's borders, while the Blades, an ancient order of spies and warriors, protect the Emperor himself and gather intelligence throughout the provinces. Religious authority in the Empire centers around the Temple of the One and the worship of the 9 divines, Atodra, and the deified Tiber Septim, now known as Talos. This religious structure brought unity to the varied beliefs across Tamriel, though many cultures maintain their traditional practices alongside imperial worship. By the late Third Era, however, cracks had begun to appear in the imperial facade. The provinces grew restless under centralized control, and conflicts erupted in several regions. The Arnesian War in Black Marsh, the ongoing strife in Morrowind between great houses and native Ashlanders, and tension between the Empire and the Aldmeri Dominion, all stretched imperial resources thin. Within Cyrodiil itself, noble families schemed for power and influence, their machinations adding to the burden upon Emperor Uriel Septim VII's shoulders. The Camarine usurpers' rebellion decades earlier had exposed vulnerabilities in imperial defense, and though defeated, the wound to imperial prestige had never fully healed. It was into this fragile political landscape that the Mythic Dawn would eventually emerge, exploiting divisions and weaknesses that had festered for generations. But to understand their threat, we must first understand the man they would eventually assassinate, the emperor who had ruled longer than most could remember, Uriel Septim VII. Chapter 2. Emperor Uriel Septim VII. Uriel Septim VII, the 21st emperor of the Septim dynasty, ascended to the Ruby Throne in the year 3E, 3068. His reign would prove to be one of the longest and most consequential in imperial history, spanning 65 years and ending only with his assassination at the hands of Mythic Dawn cultists. Yet, Uriel's rule was not without interruption. In what historians would later call the Imperial Simulacrum, the emperor was imprisoned in a realm of oblivion by his battle mage Jagar-Tharn. For 10 years, from 3E39 to 3E399, Tharn ruled in Uriel's place, having taken on the emperor's appearance through illusion magic. These dark years saw the empire fall into disarray. Provinces fought against one another as Tharn deliberately stoked conflict to distract from his increasingly erratic rule. The Staff of Chaos, a powerful artifact that Tharn had broken into 8 pieces and hidden throughout Tamriel, became the focus of a quest undertaken by an unknown hero, the eventual champion of Cyrodiil, though few records of their identity remain. When finally freed from his imprisonment, Uriel returned to find an empire in turmoil. The wounds of the simulacrum ran deep, and healing them would become the defining challenge of his later reign. Yet the experience had changed Uriel profoundly. Where once he had been known as an energetic and sometimes ruthless ruler, he returned as a more thoughtful, even mystical figure. The experiences in Oblivion had granted Uriel visions, glimpses of possible futures that haunted his dreams and guided his actions. It was these visions that led him to send an agent to Daggerfall to investigate the death of King Lysandus, unknowingly setting in motion the events that would lead to the miracle of peace or the warp in the West, an inexplicable phenomenon that simultaneously resolved multiple conflicting outcomes in the Iliac Bay region. As the decades passed, Uriel's rule grew increasingly concerned with matters beyond mortal politics. He developed a particular interest in the prophecies of the Narrated in Morrowind, going so far as to release a prisoner to Vvardenfell in 347, believing this individual might fulfill the ancient prophecy. His instincts proved correct, as this unknown prisoner would indeed become the Narrated, defeating Daygon and ending the blight that threatened Morrowind. These seemingly disparate actions, sending agents to Daggerfall and Morrowind, revealed a pattern in Uriel's later governance. He had become focused on existential threats to not just the Empire, but to Tamriel itself. Whether through his mystical visions or through intelligence gathered by the Blades, Uriel sensed dangers that others could not perceive. By 343, in the twilight of his life, Emperor Uriel Septim VII had grown physically frail, but remained sharp of mind. The weight of over 6 decades of rule showed in the deep lines of his face and the weariness in his eyes. Yet those eyes had seen things others had not, glimpses of a terrible future that he increasingly believed was imminent. It was in this state that he began to confide in certain trusted members of the Blades about his fears regarding Daedric forces and ancient prophecies. He ordered increased vigilance and security measures that some on the Elder Council considered excessive, but Uriel's visions had proven accurate before, and the loyal Blades took his concerns seriously. The Emperor's personal life had been marked by tragedy as well. His wife, Empress Colavoria, had died years earlier. His 3 legitimate sons, Crown Prince Geldal and Princes Enman and Ebel, had grown into men who, while competent in their duties, lacked the mystical insight that now guided their father's actions. Unbeknownst to most, Uriel had also sired an illegitimate son many years before, ensuring the child was hidden away for his own protection. In what would be the final year of his life, Uriel's behavior grew increasingly erratic by Imperial standards, though in retrospect his actions reveal a man desperately trying to prepare for a disaster only he could foresee. He spent long hours in the Imperial Library studying ancient texts, consulted with scholars of Daedric lore, and dispatched Blades on secretive missions throughout the provinces. As spring turned to summer in the year 343, Uriel began to make arrangements for what he seemed to know would be the end of his reign. He updated his will, met privately with each of his sons, and most significantly, retrieved the Amulet of Kings from its ceremonial display, keeping it on his person at all times, a break from tradition that sparked whispers among the Elder Council. It was during this period that the first reports of strange cults worshipping Mehroonz Daygon began to reach the Imperial city. Isolated incidents of Daedric summoning and ritual murders were reported in outlying regions, but such occurrences were not uncommon enough to raise widespread alarm. Only Uriel and his closest advisors connected these events to the Emperor's growing sense of foreboding. Then came the night that would change everything. On the 27th of last seed, 3433, Emperor Uriel Septim VII woke from a dream so vivid and terrible that it drove him to immediate action. He summoned Captain Renaud of the Blades and ordered preparation for his departure from the Imperial city through secret passages beneath the palace roots, known only to the Emperor and his most trusted protectors. The details of what happened next would be pieced together only later, through accounts from a prisoner who happened to be in the cell that connected to those secret passages. The Mythic Dawn, having infiltrated the palace, had assassinated the Emperor's 3 legitimate sons that very night, cutting off the known Septim lineage in a single coordinated strike. As Uriel Septim VII made his way through the ancient substructure beneath the Imperial city, accompanied by 3 loyal Blades, Renaud, Boris, and Glenroy, he encountered this prisoner in a moment that would later be recognized as fated Uriel looked into the prisoner's eyes and saw something. "You," he said, "I've seen you in my dreams." What followed was both the end of an era and the beginning of another. The Mythic Dawn cultists, having tracked the Emperor's escape route, launched their final assault. Despite the valiant efforts of his blades, the assassins reached Emperor Uriel Septim VII. With his final breaths, he entrusted the Amulet of Kings to the prisoner who had joined their escape attempt. Speaking his last prophetic words, closed shut the jaws of Oblivion. With a dagger in his heart, the 21st and final emperor of the Septim bloodline passed into history, leaving behind a legacy of 65 years of rule and an empire on the precipice of its greatest crisis. His death would extinguish the Dragonfires in the Temple of the One Fires that had protected Tamriel from full-scale Daedric invasion for centuries. Without a Septim on the throne to relight them, the barriers between worlds began to weaken. Uriel's life, marked by both triumphs and tragedies, came to its end just as the crisis he had foreseen began to unfold. But even in death, his actions, particularly his final decision to trust a seemingly random prisoner, would shape the course of events to come. For while the Emperor's body lay cooling in the cold stone passages beneath his city, the mechanisms of fate he had set in motion continued to turn. Chapter 3: The Dragonfires and the Covenant. At the heart of the Empire's protection against the forces of Oblivion lay an ancient covenant, a pact between mortals and the divine that had safeguarded Nirn for centuries. This was no mere superstition or religious ceremony, but a metaphysical barrier fundamental to the very safety of the mortal plane. The covenant began with Saint Alessia, the first empress, who received the blessing of Okatosh, the dragon god of time, as a reward for overthrowing the Old slave masters who had tormented humanity. Okatosh infused his divine blood into the Amulet of Kings, creating a bond between the divines and the mortal rulers of the Empire. This artifact, often called the Red Diamond or the Chimelabar, is perhaps the most significant magical object in all of Tamriel's history. Its central gem, said to be a drop of crystallized divine blood, is surrounded by 8 smaller gems representing each of the original 8 divines. The entire amulet is set in an ornate gold housing designed to be worn around the neck of the ruling emperor or empress. The true power of the amulet lies not in its material composition, but in the metaphysical covenant it represents. When a legitimate heir of the Septim bloodline, carrying the blood of Alessia and thus of Akatosh himself, wears the amulet and lights the Dragonfires in the Temple of the One, a magical barrier strengthens around Nirn, preventing large-scale incursions from the realms of Oblivion. The Temple of the One stands at the center of the Imperial city, its imposing dome visible from nearly every corner of the capital. Within its circular chamber sits the altar, where the Dragonfires burn when properly kindled. These flames are not ordinary fire, but a manifestation of the covenant between Akatosh and the Septim bloodline, a visible symbol of the invisible barrier that protects the mortal realm. The ritual of lighting the Dragonfires occurs at the beginning of each emperor's reign. Upon the death of an emperor, the fires die out, creating a period of metaphysical vulnerability until the new emperor can relight them. Throughout most of imperial history, this period of vulnerability was brief and largely inconsequential, a matter of days or at most weeks, while coronation preparations were made. But what happens when there is no heir to light the fires? This question, which had remained theoretical throughout the long centuries of the Septim dynasty, became devastatingly relevant with the assassination of Emperor Uriel Septim VII and his 3 known sons. The extinguishing of the Dragonfires without an heir to relight them created a weakness in the barriers between worlds, a weakness that the Mythic Dawn had meticulously planned to exploit. Without the protection of Akatosh's covenant, the mortal plane became vulnerable to direct invasion from Oblivion, in a way it had not been since the earliest days of mankind. To understand the significance of this vulnerability, one must comprehend the nature of Mundus, the mortal plane, and its relationship to the other realms of existence. The creation of Mundus, according to most theological accounts, began when the original Atada spirits split into two factions, those who would become the Idra, who sacrificed much of their power to create the mortal world, and the Daedra, who refused to participate. The space between Mundus and the outer realms of Aetherius, the immortal plane and source of all magicka, is known as Oblivion. This vast, chaotic realm is divided into numerous planes, each ruled by a Daedric prince, who shapes their domain according to their will and nature. While minor Daedric incursions into Nirn have occurred throughout history, the Covenant prevented any Daedric prince from physically manifesting their full power within the mortal world. This magical barrier is not merely a shield against invasion. It is a fundamental law of reality, established at the dawn of the Empire. The consequences of its failure would be catastrophic beyond measure. Without it, the boundary between Nurien and Oblivion would thin dramatically, allowing for the creation of stable portals between worlds, the Oblivion gates that would soon appear across Tamriel. The metaphysical nature of the Dragonfires and the Covenant extends beyond simple magic. It represents a binding agreement between divine and mortal forces, a promise from Akatosh that so long as his bloodline rules and would be protected from the ambitions of the Daedric princes. This agreement was not merely symbolic, but woven into the very fabric of reality. Throughout the long centuries of the Septim dynasty, few outside the highest echelons of imperial leadership truly understood the critical importance of the Dragonfires. To most citizens of the Empire, the lighting ceremony was simply another imperial tradition. Impressive and sacred, certainly, but not understood as the linchpin holding back potential apocalypse. Those with deeper knowledge of metaphysical matters, certain members of the Mages Guild, scholars of Daedric lore, and the inner circle of the Blades, recognized the true purpose of the Covenant. They understood that the unbroken line of Septim rulers was not merely a political necessity but an existential one for all of Nirn. This is why, in the aftermath of Uriel VII's assassination, the revelation of a hidden heir would become so crucial. For without a Septim to wear the amulet of kings and relight the Dragonfires, the barrier between worlds would continue to weaken, eventually allowing for a full invasion from the planes of Oblivion. The significance of the Amulet of Kings, therefore, cannot be overstated. More than a symbol of imperial authority, it was the physical manifestation of Akatosh's covenant with humanity, the key that would either lock the gates of Oblivion once more, or, in its absence, leave those gates wide open to the forces of destruction. As the Dragonfires in the Temple of the One grew cold following Emperor Uriel's death, few in the imperial city understood the true magnitude of the danger. The immediate concerns were political: the succession crisis, the shock of losing the emperor and his heirs, the questions of who would rule. But beneath these mortal troubles lurked a far greater threat, one that would soon manifest in fire and blood across Tamriel. For the first time in centuries, the barrier between Nirn and Divion began to truly weaken. In remote areas of Cyrodiil, subtle changes in the fabric of reality could be detected by those sensitive to such things. Mages noticed fluctuations in certain spells, Priests reported disturbing dreams, and those with an affinity for Daedric forces felt a growing presence, like a storm gathering on the horizon. The ancient protection that generations had taken for granted was unraveling, and as it weakened, something waited on the other side, something that had been planning this moment for years beyond counting, patiently awaiting the opportunity that now, with the death of Uriel Septim VII, had finally arrived. Chapter 4. The Mythic Dawn. In the shadows of the Empire, far from the watchful eyes of the Elder Council and the Blades, a cult grew in power and influence. They called themselves the Mythic Dawn, followers of the Daedric Prince Mehroonz, Daygon, the Lord of Destruction and Change. At their head stood a charismatic and brilliant Mer, named Moncur Cameron. Cameron was no ordinary cultist. Born to a Bosma mother and Ultima father, he possessed an intellect and magical aptitude that set him apart from most mortals. But it was his discovery of an artifact of terrible power that would set him on the path to becoming the Empire's most dangerous enemy. This artifact was the Mysterium Xerxes, an ancient tome written by Mehroonz Daygon himself. Unlike most Daedric artifacts that occasionally appear unknown, only to vanish again, the Xerxes contained knowledge so profound and dangerous that it altered the very nature of those who studied it deeply enough. How Cameron first came into possession of this book remains unclear, though some accounts suggest he recovered it from a forgotten Arlid ruin deep in the wilds of Valenwood. The Mysterium Xerxes contained secrets beyond mortal comprehension, rituals, incantations, and metaphysical concepts that blurred the boundaries between mortal and divine. Through his study of this forbidden text, Cameron began to develop a philosophy that would form the foundation of the Mythic Dawn cult. At the heart of this philosophy was a radical reinterpretation of the relationship between Aedra and Daedra, between Mundus and Oblivion. Cameron claimed that Tamriel was not the mortal realm, as commonly understood, but actually another plane of oblivion, one created through conquest and subterfuge by Lorcan, whom Cameron identified as the most insidious of Daedric princes. According to his teachings, the beings worshipped as the Nine Divines were not benevolent creator gods, but usurpers who had stolen the true reality from its rightful owner. Mundus, he taught, was meant to be a paradise, and Mehroonz Daygon was not a destroyer, but a liberator who sought to free mortals from their prison reality. These heretical ideas were compiled into Cameron's own work, the Commentaries on the Mysterium Xerxes, a 4-volume set of books that served both as recruitment tools and as coded instructions for joining the Mythic Dawn. The first 2 volumes were distributed relatively openly, appearing occasionally in bookshops throughout Tamriel. The third was harder to find, circulated only among those who showed genuine interest in the cult's teachings. The 4th volume was reserved exclusively for initiates who had proven their dedication to the cause. Together, these books contained hidden messages that, when deciphered, revealed the location of the Mythic Dawn's shrine to Mehroonz Daygon, a secret cavern near Lake Arius in the northern reaches of Cyrodiil. It was here that the most significant rituals of the cult took place, and where new members were formally initiated through blood sacrifice. The structure of the Mythic Dawn remained deliberately obscure to outsiders. Unlike the more public Daedric cults that operated throughout Tamriel, Cameron built his organization on principles of absolute secrecy and cell-based operation. Most members knew only their immediate superiors and the handful of cultists with whom they directly worked. This structure made the Mythic Dawn extraordinarily difficult for Imperial authorities to infiltrate or dismantle. At the pinnacle of this organization stood Moncur Cameron himself, referred to by his followers as Master or Lord. Below him were his children, Ruma and Raven Camoran, who served as his chief lieutenants and conduits for his will. Beneath them were the sponsors, senior cultists, tasked with recruiting and training new members, and the Mythic Dawn agents, who carried out the cult's work throughout Tamriel. What made the Mythic Dawn particularly dangerous was not just their organization, but their ambition. Unlike most Daedric cults that sought merely to worship or occasionally summon aspects of their chosen prince, Camoran's followers worked toward a specific apocalyptic goal, the permanent merging of Nirn and the Deadlands. Mehroonz is Dagon's plane of oblivion. This plan had been centuries in the making. The Mythic Dawn placed agents in positions throughout the Empire, in noble households, merchant companies, even within the Legion itself. These sleeper agents gathered intelligence, influenced policy when possible, and waited for the signal to act. The cult accumulated resources, established hidden caches of weapons and supplies across Cyrodiil, and performed smaller rituals to test the barriers between worlds. But perhaps their most impressive achievement was Mankar Camoran's creation of his own pocket realm of oblivion, a place he called Paradise, using knowledge gleaned from the Mysterium Xerxes and power granted by Uriel Dagon. Camoran fashioned a realm that appeared at first glance to be the paradise he promised his followers. This achievement demonstrated his extraordinary magical prowess, as creating an autonomous plane within Oblivion was a feat beyond even most powerful mages. Paradise served multiple purposes for the Mythic Dawn. It was a recruiting tool, with promises of immortality within its bounds offered to faithful followers. It functioned as Camoran's personal retreat, where he could commune directly with Mehroonz Daygon without the limitations imposed by Norrin's reality. And most importantly, it served as the anchor point for the ritual that would eventually tear down the barriers between worlds permanently. The cult's belief system promised its adherents power and renewal through destruction. The world, they believed, needed to be unmade before it could be properly remade. Those who served Mehroonz Dagon faithfully would be rewarded with places of honor in the new world order that would emerge from the ashes of the old. This apocalyptic vision attracted those who felt disenfranchised by imperial society, the desperate, the power-hungry, and those who genuinely believed in Camoran's twisted theology. By 3E403, the Mythic Dawn had grown into perhaps the most dangerous organization in Tamriel. Though few recognized the threat they posed, their cells operated in every major city of the Empire. Their agents had infiltrated numerous institutions, and their leader had developed magical capabilities that rivaled those of the most accomplished archmages of the Mages Guild. The assassination of Emperor Uriel Septim VII and his 3 legitimate heirs represented the culmination of years of planning. Mythic Dawn agents, disguised as members of the Imperial Watch, executed these killings with precision, eliminating the entire known Septim bloodline in a single night. This act was not merely political, it was metaphysical, designed specifically to extinguish the Dragonfires with no legitimate heir to relight them. In the aftermath of the assassinations, as the Empire reeled from the succession crisis, the Mythic Dawn launched the next phase of their plan. With the barriers between worlds weakened by the unlit Dragonfires, they began performing rituals at locations across Cyrodiil to create stable gates between Nirn and the Deadlands. The first major manifestation of their success came at the city of Kovach, in what would later be recognized as a deliberate test of their capabilities. The Mythic Dawn opened a great gate outside the city walls. Through this portal poured Daedric forces, Dremora warriors, clan-fear beasts, scamps, and other servants of Mehroonz Daygon. The city was overwhelmed, with most of its population either killed or forced to flee. The Count of Kovach, and many of his guards died defending the castle, while the city itself was reduced to burning ruins. The destruction of Kovrach served multiple purposes for the Mythic Dawn. It demonstrated the effectiveness of their gate-opening ritual. It struck fear into the heart of the Empire, and most importantly, it was a trap designed to eliminate a specific target, the hidden Septim heir, Martin, who served as a priest in the city's chapel of Akatosh. That this particular plan failed, thanks to the intervention of the same prisoner who had witnessed Uriel Septim's final moments, would prove to be the first significant setback in Mehroonz's grand design, but it would not be the last, as the Empire slowly began to recognize and respond to the existential threat that the Mythic Dawn represented. As Oblivion gates began to appear across Cyrodiil, the cult's activities became more overt. Mythic Dawn agents abandoned their cover identities to serve their master openly. Sleeper cells activated throughout the province, attacking temples, disrupting Legion operations, assassinating key officials, and performing the rituals necessary to open more gates. The Mythic Dawn had emerged from the shadows, and the apocalypse they had planned for generations had begun. The Red Dawn was rising over Tamriel, and at its center stood Mehroonz, a visionary to his followers, a madman to his enemies, but undeniably one of the most consequential figures in the history of the Third Era. And behind him, watching and waiting for the barriers between worlds to fall completely, loomed the towering figure of his patron, Mehroonz, Daygon, the Prince of Destruction. Chapter 5. Mehroonz Daygon. To understand the Oblivion crisis fully, one must understand the entity at its center. Mehroonz Daygon, one of the 17 Daedric princes, who rule over the various planes of Oblivion. Unlike the Aedra, the Auri ancestors in Aldmeri tongue, who sacrificed much of their power to create Mundus, the mortal plane, the Daedra, not our ancestors, refused to participate in creation. They retained their full power and created their own realms within Oblivion, shaped entirely by their will and reflecting their spheres of influence. Mehroonz Daygon's sphere encompasses destruction, change, revolution, energy, and ambition. His realm, the Deadlands, is a nightmarish landscape of lava seas, blackened fortresses, and storm-racked skies, a reflection of his destructive nature. Among the Daedric princes, Daygon stands as one of the most overtly hostile to the mortal realm. While princes such as Azura or Meridia might interact with mortals in ways that could be considered beneficial, and others like Sanguine or Clavicus Vile might be dangerous, but not explicitly destructive, Daygon's interactions with Nirn have been consistently catastrophic throughout recorded history. The Prince of Destruction appears in the mythologies of numerous cultures across Tamriel, though often under different names. To the ancient Nords, he was known as Daygon, a demon of destruction, who tested them with natural disasters. In Khajiiti tradition, he is Mehroonz, one of the children of Fadamai banished by Azura for destroying many things. The Dark Elves of Morrowind include him in their House of Troubles, Daedra, who test the Dunra people, but are not to be worshipped. Mehroonz Daygon's physical form, when he chooses to manifest it, is both terrifying and awe-inspiring, towering far above any mortal. His crimson skin appears like hardened magma, cracked in places to reveal the burning fire within. 4 massive arms bear weapons of impossible size and sharpness, while his head is adorned with sweeping horns. His voice alone can shatter stone and instill primal fear in those unfortunate enough to hear it. But to reduce Daygon to merely his physical aspects would be a grave misunderstanding of his nature. As a Daedric prince, he is a being of pure conceptual power, the embodiment of destruction and revolution itself. The form he presents to mortals is merely a fraction of his true essence, filtered through mortal perception into something comprehensible, if terrifying. Throughout the history of Tamriel, Mehroonz Daygon has made several attempts to extend his influence directly into Nirn. The fourscore war between Morrowind and the Renan Empire is said to have been influenced by his machinations. The destruction of Mornord at the end of the First Era was attributed to his direct intervention, when he appeared in the city and laid waste to it before being banished by Elmalexium Sothasil. Perhaps most notably, Daygon was involved in the Imperial Simulacrum, when Jagar Tharn imprisoned Emperor Uriel Septim VII in a realm of oblivion, while Tharn himself communicated with and drew power from Daygon. The prince's exact role in this plot remains somewhat unclear. Was he merely a power source for Tharn's ambitions, or was this an early attempt to weaken the Septim bloodline and the covenant it maintained? What is known with certainty is that Daygon has long harbored a particular enmity toward Nirn and the barriers that prevent his full manifestation there. Some metaphysical scholars suggest this hatred stems from events in the distant past, perhaps even from the creation of Mundus itself. Others propose that destruction is simply his nature, and the ordered reality of Mundus represents the ultimate affront to his chaotic essence. The relationship between Mehroonz Daygon and Mankar Cameron appears to have begun sometime in the early Third Era, though exactly when or how remains obscure. What is clear is that Daygon provided Cameron with the Mysterium Xarxes and granted him unprecedented access to knowledge of Oblivion's workings. In return, Cameron pledged himself and his followers to bringing about Daygon's manifestation on Nirn. This arrangement offered benefits to both parties. For Cameron, it provided magical power beyond that available to most mortals, and the promise of a form of immortality in paradise. For Daygon, it created a mortal agent capable of coordinating the complex actions needed to weaken the barriers between worlds sufficiently for a full invasion. The Deadlands, Mehroonz Daygon's plane of oblivion, reflects its master's nature perfectly. It is a realm of perpetual destruction and renewal, where nothing remains stable for long. The landscape is dominated by seas of lava and blackened islands of volcanic rock, with skies perpetually choked by ash and crossed by lightning. Towering citadels of black metal and stone rise from this inhospitable terrain, serving as command centers for Daygon's armies. These armies consist primarily of the humanoid Daedra known as Dremora, intelligent, hierarchical warriors who serve the Prince of Destruction with fanatical loyalty, organized into strict castes, with titles such as Kainval, Kainreeve, and Kain Marcher. The Dremora function as the officers and elite troops of Dagon's forces. Below them in the hierarchy are numerous lesser Daedra clanfear, Scamps, Zivilai, and others, each created to fulfill specific roles in both the Deadlands and in any potential invasion of Nirn. The environmental conditions of the Deadlands would be immediately fatal to most mortals without magical protection. The air itself is toxic, filled with sulfurous compounds and ash that would scorch human lungs. Within minutes, the ground burns hot enough to melt the soles of boots, while random geysers of flame erupt without warning. Even the water, what little exists, is caustic and poisonous. It is from this nightmarish realm that Daygon planned his invasion of Tamriel. For centuries, the Prince of Destruction had tested the barriers between worlds, probing for weaknesses and studying the nature of the covenant that kept him at bay. Through Mankar Camoran and the Mysterium Xarxes, he developed a comprehensive understanding of how the Dragonfires functioned and how they might be permanently disabled. The plan that emerged was multi-layered and patient. First, eliminate the entire Septim bloodline to ensure the Dragonfires could not be relit. Second, use the resulting weakening of the barriers to establish Oblivion gates throughout Tamriel. Third, channel power through these gates to create great gates capable of transporting larger forces and siege engines. Finally, once sufficient forces had been deployed to Nirn, Mehroonz Daygon himself would physically cross over, permanently destroying the barriers between worlds. This strategy revealed a level of methodical planning not often attributed to the Prince of Destruction. While chaos and upheaval are indeed his domain, Daygon is also a prince of revolution, of calculated overthrow, and systematic replacement of existing orders. The Oblivion Crisis demonstrated not just his destructive capacity, but his strategic intellect. The sigil stones that powered the Oblivion Gates represent a perfect example of Daygon's approach. These artifacts, created from Creatia, the raw material of Oblivion, stabilized the portals between realms. Each stone required significant magical investment to create, showing that Daygon was willing to commit substantial resources to this invasion. The stones were placed atop towers within miniature portions of the Deadlands that manifested around each gate, creating stable beachheads for the invading forces. Perhaps most telling about Mehroonz Daygon's nature and intentions was his creation of the Siege Crawler, an enormous Daedric war machine designed specifically for the invasion of Nirn. This behemoth of metal and magic, which emerged from the Great Gate at Bruma, demonstrated that Daygon had studied mortal warfare and developed countermeasures tailored to Tamriel's defenses. This was no mindless destroyer, but a calculating conqueror with clear objectives. What would have happened had Daygon's plans succeeded? The accounts of Kavach and other communities that faced Daedric invasion provide grim clues. Total destruction of existing infrastructure, mass slaughter of resistors, and the transformation of Nirn's very landscape into something resembling the Deadlands themselves. Mehroonz Daygon sought not merely to conquer the mortal plane, but to remake it in his image, a process that would have meant the effective end of mortal civilization, as it was known. It is a testament to the threat Daygon posed, that his invasion united such disparate forces against him. Imperial legionnaires fought alongside Blade's agents and provincial guards. The Mages Guild set aside scholarly pursuits to battle Daedric magic. Ordinary citizens took up arms against creatures from Nightmare. Even the other Daedric princes, traditionally reluctant to directly oppose one another, made no moves to support Daygon's invasion, perhaps recognizing that the destruction of Nirn would eliminate a realm they all found fascinating in their own ways. In the end, Mehroonz Daygon did achieve what no other Daedric prince had managed before. He physically manifested his full power on Nirn, appearing in the Imperial City itself. For a brief, terrifying moment, the Prince of Destruction walked the mortal plane, towering over the Temple of the One, his four arms brandishing weapons capable of leveling the city with ease. That this moment of triumph proved brief, cut short by Martin Septim's sacrifice and the intervention of Akatosh, does not diminish the magnitude of what Daygon accomplished. The barriers between worlds, maintained for millennia by the Covenant, had been broken, though they would be restored in a new form. The original pact was gone forever, changing the metaphysical relationship between Oblivion and Mundus in ways that scholars would debate for generations to come. Mehroonz Daygon retreated to the Deadlands, following his defeat. But like all Daedric princes, he is immortal and patient. The events of the Oblivion Crisis represent just one chapter in his eternal existence. His influence continues to be felt on Nirn through smaller cults, isolated artifacts, and the lingering trauma of those who survived his invasion. And somewhere in the flames of the Deadlands, the Prince of Destruction waits, perhaps already forming new plans for the realm that has defied him time and again. Chapter 6. The Oblivion Gates. The Oblivion Gates' massive, fiery portals that tore through the fabric of reality became the most visible, and terrifying aspect of the Oblivion crisis, standing dozens of feet tall. These structures of black stone and burning sigils served as direct connections between Nirn and the Deadlands, Mehroonz Daygon's plane of oblivion. When the Dragonfires went dark following Emperor Uriel Septim VII's death, the metaphysical barrier between Oblivion and Mundus weakened significantly. This weakness allowed the Mythic Dawn cultists to create stable, lasting connections between the planes, the gates through which Daygon's forces would pour. The physical appearance of an Oblivion gate was unmistakable and designed to inspire terror. Each gate manifested as an enormous archway of jagged obsidian-like stone, inscribed with Daedric runes that glowed with an internal fire. Within the arch burned a portal of swirling flame and energy, through which could be glimpsed distorted images of the hellish landscape beyond. The ground around each gate would rapidly decay, becoming scorched and barren, with fissures opening to reveal molten rock beneath the surface, a small portion of the Deadlands bleeding into Nirn. The process of creating an Oblivion gate required precise ritual and considerable magical power. Mythic Dawn cultists would gather at locations where the barrier between worlds was already thin, often ancient magical sites or places where significant bloodshed had occurred. There they would perform complex ceremonies derived from the Mysterium Xarxes, sacrificing followers or captives to provide the initial energy needed to pierce the veil between worlds. Once established, a gate would remain stable indefinitely, unless its power source, a sigil stone, was removed from its anchor point within the Deadlands. This clever design meant that simply destroying the gate from the north side was impossible. One had to physically enter Oblivion, fight through Daedric forces, and remove the sigil stone that powered the connection. What made this challenge even more daunting was that each gate opened to a specific area of the Deadlands that had been prepared specifically to defend the sigil stone. These areas, while small compared to the vastness of Mehroonz Dagon's realm, were completely hostile environments designed with multiple layers of defense. The typical layout included a landing area where travelers from Nirn would arrive, followed by a treacherous landscape of lava flows, jagged rocks, and poisonous gas vents. Beyond these natural hazards stood Daedric fortifications, usually a series of towers connected by bridges over lakes of fire, all heavily guarded by Dremora warriors and lesser Daedra. At the heart of these fortifications stood the Sigil Tower, a massive structure of black metal and stone that housed the sigil stone at its very top. These towers were architectural marvels in their way, defying conventional physics with their impossible geometries and strange materials. Rooms might connect in ways that made no sense to the mortal mind, with corridors that seemed to loop back on themselves, or doors that opened to entirely unexpected locations. The journey to the top of a sigil tower was designed to be arduous and disorienting. Multiple levels, filled with Daedric defenders, needed to be traversed, often with no obvious path forward. Some towers incorporated massive chambers where lava flowed upward against gravity, while others featured rooms where reality itself seemed to warp and shift unpredictably. The sigil stone itself rested in a device called the Sigil Keep, a containment mechanism at the very top of the tower that channeled the stone's energy to maintain the connection to Nirn. These stones were objects of considerable power, created from raw creatia, the chaotic matter of Oblivion, shaped and stabilized through Daedric magic. Each appeared as a perfectly spherical black orb, with swirling energies visible beneath its surface, hovering slightly above its pedestal, and emanating waves of heat and power. The removal of the sigil stone would trigger an immediate collapse of the connection between planes. The portion of the Deadlands that had been linked to Nirn would rapidly destabilize, and anyone still within that space, when the connection fully severed, would be violently ejected back to Nirn, appearing at the location of the gate moments before the structure itself imploded in a spectacular burst of fire and debris. What made the Oblivion Gates particularly effective as an invasion strategy was their unpredictability. They could appear anywhere, at any time, with little warning. A peaceful farming community might suddenly find a gate erupting from the earth in nearby fields, disgorging Daedra before an organized defense could be mounted. Even well-garrisoned cities could be caught unprepared if gates opened simultaneously at multiple points around their walls. The gates varied in size and power as well. Most were roughly the same dimensions, perhaps 30 feet tall, and wide enough for several Dremora to march through abreast. But as the invasion progressed, the Mythic Dawn began creating great gates, portals of immense size, capable of allowing much larger forces through at once. The most infamous of these great gates appeared outside the city of Quach, the first major population center to fall to the invasion. This gate, significantly larger than the standard variety, allowed an overwhelming force of Daedra to quickly surround and sack the city. Only the chapel of Akatush remained standing amid the ruins, sheltering the few survivors who had managed to barricade themselves inside. A later great gate opened near the city of Bruma, as part of the Mythic Dawn's push toward the Imperial City, was designed specifically to transport a massive Daedric siege engine called the Siege Crawler. This behemoth of metal and magic could have potentially breached the walls of the Imperial City itself, had it not been stopped by the combined forces of Cyrodiil's counties, led by the mysterious figure who would become known as the Champion of Cyrodiil. The nature of travel through an Oblivion Gate merits special attention, as it represents one of the few documented instances of mortals physically entering a Daedric realm and returning to tell the tale. Those who survived the experience described a moment of disorientation and extreme heat as they passed through the fiery portal, followed by an overwhelming assault on the senses upon arrival. In the Deadlands, the air within Mehroonz, Daygon's realm, burned the lungs and stung the eyes, filled with sulfurous compounds and ash. The constant roar of lava flows, the screams of tortured souls, and the harsh barking language of Dremora created a cacophony that assaulted the ears. The ground itself radiated heat that could be felt through the soles of boots, while the crimson light cast by the lava and the perpetually stormy sky above created a disorienting visual environment where shadows moved strangely and distances were difficult to judge. Time itself seemed to flow differently within Oblivion. Some who ventured through the gates reported that what felt like hours in the Deadlands translated to mere minutes on Nirn, while others experienced the opposite effect. Whether this was an inherent property of Oblivion or a deliberate manipulation by Mehroonz Daygon remains unclear. The psychological impact of the gates cannot be overstated. For the average citizen of Tamriel, Daedra had been distant threats at worst, subjects of cautionary tales or religious warnings. The sudden appearance of physical portals to Oblivion, with very real monsters emerging to slaughter and destroy, shattered the psychological security of entire communities. Many survivors of Daedric attacks reported persistent nightmares, waking terrors, and an inability to feel safe even after the gates were closed and the invasion repelled. For the Mythic Dawn cultists who facilitated the creation of these gates, the portals represented something entirely different, the first step toward the paradise that Manco Camoran had promised them. They believed that by helping to tear down the barriers between worlds, they were hastening the arrival of a new age, where faithful servants of Mehroonz Daygon would be rewarded with power and immortality. This stark contrast in perspective highlights the fundamental conflict at the heart of the Oblivion crisis. What appeared as apocalyptic invasion to most was seen as glorious revolution by a dedicated few. The Oblivion Gates stood as physical manifestations of this ideological divide, thresholds between not just different physical realms, but between fundamentally opposed visions of reality itself. By the height of the crisis, it is estimated that hundreds of gates had opened across Tamriel, with the highest concentration in Cyrodiil itself. Each provincial government responded differently to the threat. In Cyrodiil, the Mages Guild provided crucial expertise in understanding the magical nature of the gates, while the Fighters Guild and Imperial Legion formed the backbone of the military response. The Blades, operating largely in secret, focused on the search for Martin Septim and the Amulet of Kings, recognizing that the gates were merely symptoms of the underlying metaphysical breach. The most successful strategy against the gates emerged through trial and error. Small, highly mobile teams proved more effective than large military units at infiltrating the Deadlands, navigating the sigil towers, and retrieving the sigil stones. The champion of Cyrodiil, whose identity remains a subject of debate among historians, reportedly closed dozens of gates, personally using this approach, developing techniques that were later taught to other adventurers and soldiers. As knowledge of how to close the gates spread, a more coordinated resistance developed. Communities established warning systems to alert each other when new gates appeared. Magical scholars studied the retrieved sigil stones, learning more about their properties and how they might be countered. Some particularly brave souls even began using closed gates as markers for new settlements, believing the land around a former gate would be resistant to the opening of new portals, a theory that proved to have mixed results at best. When the final battle came at the Temple of the One in the Imperial City, and Martin Septim sacrificed himself to permanently seal the barriers between Mundus and Oblivion, all existing gates collapsed simultaneously. The sudden closure of so many portals created magical aftershocks that were felt by sensitive individuals across Tamriel, a moment of profound relief as the invasion was finally definitively ended. The physical remnants of the gates largely disappeared with their closure, though in some locations the blackened, twisted stone archways remained as memorials to what had occurred. The land around former gate sites remained blighted for years, though most eventually recovered. Some areas, particularly those where great gates had stood, remained permanently altered, barren patches where nothing would grow, where the air occasionally shimmered with residual magical energy, and where locals reported strange dreams if they slept too close by. But the most enduring legacy of the Oblivion Gates was their impact on the collective psyche of Tamriel's people. A generation grew up in the shadow of the invasion, raised on stories of fiery portals and the demons that came through them. Religious worship of the Nine Divines, particularly Okatosh, surged in the aftermath of the crisis, while interest in Daedric research became simultaneously more cautious and more focused. And somewhere beyond the perception of mortals, in the infinite realms of Oblivion, the Deadlands continued to burn as they always had. The gates had closed, but Daygon himself remained undiminished immortal, patient, and perhaps already devising new ways to reach the mortal plane that had denied him once again. Chapter 7. Martin Septim's Journey. In the quiet chapel of Koach, as Daedra rampaged through the burning city outside, a humble priest of Akatosh named Martin found himself face to face with his destiny, a destiny he neither sought nor initially believed. Martin Septim was the illegitimate son of Emperor Uriel Septim VII, hidden away and raised unaware of his heritage. He grew into a thoughtful, compassionate man who dedicated himself to the service of the Nine Divines, particularly Akatosh. But Martin's past held darker chapters than many realized. Born likely around 3E39 during the Imperial Simulacrum, Martin's early life remains largely undocumented. It is known that Uriel Septim VII, after reclaiming his throne from Jagar Tharn, made arrangements to hide his illegitimate son, perhaps out of concern for the boy's safety, or to avoid political complications. Whatever the emperor's reasons, Martin grew up ignorant of his true parentage, raised far from the imperial city in circumstances that remain unclear. By his own later admission, Martin's youth was troubled. As a young man, he fell in with a Daedric cult, not the Mythic Dawn, but one of the many smaller cults that existed throughout Tamriel. Drawn by promises of power and forbidden knowledge, the young Martin delved into dark magical practices, even participating in rituals that he would later recall with profound regret. It was a catastrophic event that changed Martin's path. During one particularly ambitious ritual, something went terribly wrong. Friends died. How many, and in what manner, Martin never fully revealed, but the tragedy shook him to his core, forcing him to confront the dangers of unchecked ambition and the seductive lure of Daedric power. Seeking redemption, he turned to the 9 divines, finding in their teachings a structure and purpose that had been missing from his life. Martin's transformation from dabbler in dark magic to dedicated priest was no superficial change. He committed himself to years of study and contemplation, eventually taking up residence at the chapel of Akatosh in Quach, where he became known for his compassion, wisdom, and devotion. Few who knew the gentle priest could have imagined his complicated past, or the even more extraordinary future that awaited him. When the Oblivion Gate opened outside Quach, in last seed of 3E43, Martin was among those who helped survivors reach the safety of the chapel. As the city burned around them, he ministered to the wounded, offered comfort to the frightened, and maintained a calm presence that helped prevent panic among the refugees trapped inside the chapel's walls. It was here, amidst the aftermath of destruction, that Martin's life changed forever. A stranger, the same prisoner who had witnessed Emperor Uriel Septim's death, arrived in Korvach with an incredible tale. Uriel Septim had been assassinated, along with his known heirs. According to the stranger, the emperor's dying words had referenced a hidden son, and the Blades believed Martin to be that son, the last of the Septim bloodline, and the Empire's only hope for relighting the Dragonfires. Martin's initial reaction was disbelief. He had lived his entire life as a commoner, with no hint of imperial heritage. The idea that he might be the Emperor's son seemed absurd, especially coming from a stranger in the aftermath of a Daedric attack. Yet there was something in the visitor's earnestness, in the details they shared about Uriel Septim's final moments, that gave Martin pause. Reluctantly, Martin agreed to travel to Waynham Priory, where Joffrey, Grand Master of the Blades, could explain more fully. This first step away from Korvach represented more than a physical journey. It was the beginning of Martin's transformation from obscure priest to imperial heir. The journey to Waynham Priory was fraught with danger. The roads of Cyrodiil had grown unsafe, with bandits taking advantage of the chaos and Daedra emerging from gates that appeared with increasing frequency. For Martin, who had spent years in the relative safety of Korvach's chapel, the harsh realities of travel in a province under siege came as a shock. Yet even then, his resilience and adaptability, traits that would serve him well in the trials to come, began to show themselves. Upon reaching Waynham Priory, Martin found not clarity, but more chaos. The Mythic Dawn had attacked the Priory in search of the Amulet of Kings, forcing Joffrey to flee to Cloud Ruler Temple, the hidden fortress of the Blades. in the northern mountains, near Brumar. It was there, in that ancient stronghold, that Martin finally began to accept the truth of his heritage. Cloud Ruler Temple marked a turning point in Martin's journey. The fortress, built into the side of a mountain, had served as a refuge for the Blades for centuries. Its high walls and remote location offered security that could not be found elsewhere in Cyrodiil during the crisis. For Martin, it became both sanctuary and classroom, a place where he could safely begin the process of transforming from priest to emperor. This transformation was neither quick nor easy. Martin had spent decades developing his identity as a servant of Akarchesh, with no thought of temporal power or political leadership. Now he found himself thrust into a role that demanded both the weight of imperial expectation, pressed heavily upon shoulders accustomed to bearing only priestly vestments. Yet Martin possessed qualities that made him uniquely suited to this unexpected role. His compassion and empathy, honed through years of tending to his congregation, gave him insight into the suffering of Cyrodiil's people during the crisis. His scholarly mind, well versed in theological and magical studies, proved valuable in understanding the metaphysical nature of the threat they faced. Even his youthful dalliance with Daedric magic provided useful knowledge about the enemy they now confronted. Perhaps most importantly, Martin brought a humble perspective to the awesome responsibility that had been placed upon him. Unlike one raised from birth to expect a throne, Martin never took his position for granted. Each life risked in his name, each sacrifice made to protect him or advance his cause, weighed heavily on his conscience. This awareness fostered a determination to be worthy of such devotion, to ensure that no sacrifice would be in vain. While safe within Cloud Ruler Temple, Martin turned his scholarly attention to the central problem of the crisis: how to relight the Dragonfires without the Amulet of Kings, which had been stolen by the Mythic Dawn. Through extensive research in ancient texts, brought to him by the Blades, he eventually discovered an alternative path. An obscure ritual described in the Mysterium Xarxes itself. This discovery marked another crucial evolution in Martin's journey. The decision to use the Mysterium Xarxes, a Daedric artifact of incredible power and danger, was not made lightly. Martin understood better than most the risks of dabbling in such magic, having seen firsthand in his youth how quickly Daedric influence could corrupt and destroy. Yet he also recognized that desperate times called for desperate measures. The irony was not lost on him that his salvation, and potentially that of all Tamriel, might come through the very sort of dark knowledge he had renounced years before. Working with the Mysterium Xarxes took a visible toll on Martin. Those who knew him during this period described how he would emerge from hours of study, looking haggard, with a distant look in his eyes. The book spoke directly to its reader's darkest impulses, constantly tempting with promises of power and knowledge. That Martin withstood this influence testified to both his willpower and his growth. Since his troubled youth, the ritual Martin discovered required 4 specific ingredients: a great welkin stone, the blood of a divine, which he determined could be found in the armor of Tiber Septim, a great Sigiv stone from a great Oblivion gate, and a Daedric artifact. Gathering these components became the focus of efforts by the champion of Cyrodiil and the Blades, while Martin continued his studies and gradually assumed more leadership responsibilities. During this period of preparation, Martin began to develop the qualities of a true leader. He started by advising on military matters regarding the defense of Brumar, which faced an increasing Daedric threat due to its proximity to Cloud Ruler Temple. Initially deferring to the expertise of others, Martin gradually gained confidence in his own judgment. earning the respect of seasoned warriors and nobles alike. The pivotal moment came when Martin insisted on personally overseeing the defense of Brumo against a major Daedric assault, against the protests of Jaffre and other blades who feared risking the last Septim heir in open battle. Martin argued that an emperor who would not fight alongside his people was not worthy of the throne. This decision revealed a profound shift in Martin's self-perception. From reluctant heir to committed leader willing to share in the dangers faced by those he would rule. The Battle of Brumo became legendary, with Martin fighting alongside the champion of Cyrodiil and united forces from all of Cyrodiil's counties. His presence on the battlefield not only inspired the troops, but demonstrated to the counts and countesses of Cyrodiil that this previously unknown heir possessed the courage and character needed in an emperor. The battle, which involved allowing a great gate to open so that the champion could enter it and retrieve the needed Great Seal Stone, was a gamble that paid off, though at considerable cost in lives. With the final component for the ritual obtained, Martin performed a complex ceremony that opened a portal to Mankar Cameron's paradise, the pocket realm of Oblivion, where the Mythic Dawn leader had taken the Amulet of Kings. The champion of Cyrodiil volunteered to enter this dangerous realm, eventually returning with the amulet after defeating Cameron himself. The moment Martin placed the Amulet of Kings around his neck marked the culmination of his transformation. The gem glowed with an inner fire, recognizing and responding to the Septim bloodline that flowed in his veins. Any lingering doubts about his heritage vanished in that moment of connection with the ancient artifact that had symbolized imperial authority for centuries. With the amulet recovered, Martin prepared to travel to the Imperial City to light the Dragonfires and end the Oblivion crisis. The journey south from Cloud Ruler Temple was tense but hopeful. For the first time since the crisis began, a clear path to resolution seemed within reach. Martin, now fully embracing his role as Emperor-to-be, directed the Blades and their allies with a quiet authority that seemed to have developed naturally from his earlier uncertainty. Upon reaching the Imperial City, Martin and his entourage found it under attack from Mythic Dawn cultists, yet largely intact. Making their way to the Temple District, they arrived at the Temple of the One, where the ceremonial lighting of the Dragonfires would take place. But Daygon had anticipated this moment. As Martin prepared for the ceremony, the impossible occurred. The Prince of Destruction himself physically manifested within the Imperial City, breaking through the weakened barriers between worlds in a last desperate attempt to prevent the Dragonfires from being relit. In this moment of ultimate crisis, Martin Septim made the most consequential decision of his journey, recognizing that conventional means of victory had been rendered impossible by Daygon's physical manifestation. Martin chose a different path. Drawing on his deep understanding of the covenant between the divines and the mortal world, he realized that the Amulet of Kings contained the divine essence of Akatosh himself, power that could be released through an act of supreme sacrifice. Without hesitation, Martin shattered the Amulet of Kings, releasing its ancient power and merging his own life force with the divine essence of Akatosh. The transformation was immediate and awe-inspiring. Where Martin had stood moments before, now towered a massive dragon of golden light, the avatar of Akatosh, manifest in the mortal world. The battle between the avatar of Akatosh and Mehroonz Daygon was brief but cataclysmic. Two beings of immense power, one divine, one Daedric, clashed in the heart of the Imperial City. Ultimately, the avatar prevailed, banishing Daygon back to Oblivion and establishing a new, permanent barrier between Mundus and the Daedric realms, one that would stand without the need for Dragonfires, or continued Imperial rituals. As the battle ended, the avatar of Akatosh transformed into a massive dragon statue in the center of the Temple of the One, a permanent memorial to Martin's sacrifice and the divine intervention that saved Tamriel. Martin Septim himself did not survive this transformation. His mortal essence had become one with Akatosh, his sacrifice complete. In less than a year, Martin had journeyed from obscure priest to sacrificial emperor, a path he had never sought, but ultimately embraced with both humility and determination. He never sat upon the ruby throne, never wore the imperial crown, never ruled in any conventional sense, yet his impact on the empire, and indeed all of Tamriel, was greater than that of many emperors who had reigned for decades. Martin Septim's legacy extended far beyond the end of the Oblivion crisis. Though the Septim bloodline ended with him, the covenant between Akatosh and the mortal world was renewed in a new form. The empire would continue under new leadership, eventually passing to the Mede dynasty, but the memory of the last Septim, the emperor who never reigned yet saved the world, would inspire generations to come. In chapels and temples across Tamriel, particularly those dedicated to Akatosh, Martin came to be venerated as a saint, the mortal who gave himself fully to the divine, and in doing so exemplified the highest virtues of sacrifice and duty. The great dragon statue in the Temple of the One became a site of pilgrimage, drawing visitors from across the continent who wished to pay homage to both Akatosh and his mortal champion. Perhaps the most poignant aspect of Martin's journey was its completion of a circle begun in his youth. The young man who had once been tempted by Daedric power ultimately became the instrument of a divine, using his understanding of both mortal limitations and divine potential to save the world from Daedric destruction. What began in darkness ended in the brightest light imaginable, a transformation as profound metaphysically as it was personally. Martin Septim, priest, scholar, reluctant heir, and final emperor of the Septim dynasty, remains one of the most enigmatic and inspiring figures in Tamriel's long history. His journey from the humble chapel in Kovach to the moment of ultimate sacrifice in the Temple of the One spans relatively little time in the grand chronicle of the empire, yet its significance resonates through the ages. Those who knew Martin personally often spoke of his quiet strength and scholarly demeanor. Unlike many who find themselves suddenly elevated to power, Martin never lost touch with his humble origins or forgot the common people he had once served as a priest. This groundedness informed his decisions throughout the crisis, keeping him focused on the suffering of ordinary citizens, even as he grappled with metaphysical threats and imperial politics. Martin's personal writings, preserved in the archives of Cloud Ruler Temple, reveal a man deeply conflicted about his newfound role, yet determined to fulfill it honorably. In one particularly moving passage, written shortly after the Battle of Bruma, he reflected, "I never sought this burden, yet now I cannot imagine setting it aside. Each face I see, looking to me for leadership, for hope. They do not see Martin the priest, but a symbol of something greater. I must become what they need me to be, even as I remain true to what I know is right. Akatosh, guide me, for the path grows darker, and I fear what waits at its end." This internal struggle between the man he had been and the emperor he needed to become defined Martin's journey. Unlike his father Uriel, who had been raised from birth to rule, Martin had to compress decades of preparation into mere months. That he managed to do so with such grace speaks to an inner strength that few suspected when they first encountered the soft-spoken priest of Kovach. Those who served with Martin during the crisis often remarked upon his rapid evolution as a leader. In the early days at Cloud Ruler Temple, he deferred to Joffrey and other blades in most matters, focusing his attention almost exclusively on scholarly research into the Mysterium Xerxes. As time passed, however, he began to assert himself more confidently in councils of war and diplomatic discussions. By the time of the Battle of Bruma, Martin had developed a commanding presence that belied his lack of formal training. He spoke with authority tempered by thoughtfulness, made decisions after carefully considering advice, but without unnecessary delay, and demonstrated a strategic mind that earned respect even from veteran military leaders. When he addressed the assembled forces before the battle, soldiers who had never seen him before found themselves inspired to follow this unknown heir into the very jaws of oblivion. Perhaps most remarkable was Martin's ability to inspire loyalty in those around him. The Blades, traditionally devoted to the Emperor out of duty and tradition, came to follow Martin out of genuine admiration. The champion of Cyrodiil, whose initial task had simply been to find the hidden heir, became Martin's most trusted agent and friend. Even the counts and countesses of Cyrodiil, initially skeptical of this previously unknown imperial son, eventually rallied to his banner. This loyalty was earned not through grand gestures or political maneuvering, but through Martin's authentic character. He listened more than he spoke. He shared in hardships rather than exempting himself from them. He admitted when he was uncertain rather than feigning omniscience. These qualities, rare in any leader but particularly in imperial politics, created a foundation of trust that proved crucial during the darkest moments of the crisis. Martin's background as a priest of Akatosh took on increasing significance as the crisis deepened. What might have seemed merely coincidental at first, that the hidden heir had devoted his life to the very divine most central to the imperial covenant, gradually revealed itself as something more profound. Some theological scholars have since suggested that Akatosh himself guided Martin's path long before the crisis began, preparing his chosen champion through years of spiritual discipline and study. Whether divinely ordained or merely fortuitous, Martin's religious training proved invaluable. His understanding of the theoretical relationship between Aedra and Daedra, between Mundus and Oblivion, gave him insights that no purely political leader could have possessed. When confronted with the Mysterium Xerxes, Martin could approach it not just as a desperate man seeking solutions, but as a scholar trained to recognize and resist its corrupting influence. Similarly, Martin's youthful experiences with the Daedric magic, though he recalled them with shame, provided crucial knowledge during the crisis. He understood the mindset of cultists, the allure of Daedric power, and the manipulative tactics used by Daedric princes in ways that most imperial advisors could not. This dark chapter of his past, which might have disqualified him from leadership in normal times, became an unexpected asset during this most abnormal of threats. The culmination of Martin's journey in the Temple of the One demonstrated the perfect synthesis of all that he had been and become. In that moment of crisis, with Mehroonz Daygon physically manifest in the imperial city, Martin drew upon every aspect of his unusual life experience. The priest of Akatosh understood the theological implications of the Amulet of Kings and its connection to divine power. The former dabbler in Daedric magic recognized both the limitations and vulnerabilities of a Daedric prince. The scholar who had studied the Mysterium Xerxes comprehended the metaphysical principles that might allow for a new covenant. The leader who had gained confidence through the trials of the crisis could make an instant, decisive choice without hesitation, and the man who had always placed the welfare of others above his own could willingly sacrifice himself for the sake of all Tamriel. In shattering the Amulet of Kings and merging with the essence of the Katosh, Martin transcended the imperial legacy he had so recently accepted. He became something greater than emperor, a divine champion whose sacrifice would resonate through history far longer than any political reign. The theological implications of Martin's transformation remain a subject of debate among scholars of the Nine Divines. Some maintain that Martin's essence was completely absorbed into Akatosh, representing the ultimate communion between mortal and divine. Others suggest that some aspect of Martin's consciousness continues to exist within the divine nature of Akatosh, perhaps as a distinct aspect or avatar. A few fringe theories even propose that Martin himself achieved a form of apotheosis, similar to Tiber Septim's ascension as Talos, though mainstream theological authorities generally reject this view. Whatever the metaphysical reality, the cultural impact of Martin's sacrifice was immediate and profound. In the days following the end of the crisis, as news spread throughout Tamriel, spontaneous memorials appeared in towns and cities across the continent. People who had never seen Martin, who knew him only as the unexpected heir who had saved them from Daedric invasion, left flowers, candles, and written thanks at shrines to Akatosh. In the imperial city itself, the temple district became a site of continuous vigil for weeks after the crisis ended. Citizens gathered day and night around the dragon statue that had once been Martin and Akatosh combined, sharing stories of their experiences during the invasion and expressing gratitude for their deliverance. Many reported feeling a sense of peace and protection in the presence of the statue that went beyond normal religious experience. As the immediate aftermath of the crisis passed, and the Empire began the long process of rebuilding, Martin's legacy continued to evolve without a direct Septim heir. The Elder Council assumed governance of the Empire, eventually leading to the rise of the Mehroonz dynasty. Yet even these new emperors ruled in the shadow of Martin's sacrifice, their legitimacy implicitly measured against the standard of selfless duty he had established. The common people of Tamriel, particularly in Cyrodiil, developed a complex remembrance of Martin that blended historical fact with emerging legend. Tales spread of Martin appearing to people in dreams, offering guidance or comfort. Chapels of Akatosh reported increased attendance, with many new devotees citing Martin's example as their inspiration. Some parents began naming children after him, hoping to instill similar virtues of courage and compassion. Perhaps most significantly, Martin's story changed how many people understood the relationship between the Empire and the divine. The traditional view had emphasized the Dragonfires as a symbol of the covenant between Akatosh and the Septim bloodline. Specifically, Martin's sacrifice established a new, broader covenant, one that protected all of Tamriel without requiring a dragonborn emperor to maintain it. This theological shift subtly democratized the divine protection once associated exclusively with imperial authority. In the decades and centuries following the Oblivion crisis, as Tamriel faced new threats and changes, the memory of Martin Septim continued to inspire those who studied his brief but consequential life. Leaders faced with difficult choices would ask what Martin would have done in their place. Priests of Akatosh would cite his example when teaching the meaning of true sacrifice. Scholars of history would point to his unique journey as evidence that greatness can emerge from the most unexpected sources. The last Septim never ruled from the ruby throne, never issued an imperial decree, never even wore the Septim crown. His entire identity as heir, an emperor, lasted less than a year. Yet, in that brief time, Martin Septim embodied the highest ideals of leadership and service, culminating in an act of sacrifice that saved not just the Empire but all of Nord. In the end, Martin's journey from priest to savior represented the most essential truth at the heart of the Septim legacy, that the power to protect and preserve comes not from authority itself, but from the willingness to use that authority for the greater good, no matter the personal cost. In this, the last of the Septims may have been the greatest of them all. Chapter 8. The Fall and Rebirth. The Imperial City, the heart of Tamriel, had withstood countless threats throughout its long history. Built upon the foundations of an ancient Eyelid city, its gleaming white gold tower reached toward the heavens as a symbol of imperial might and permanence. But as Mehroonz Daygon's forces gathered for their final assault, even this eternal city trembled. With the amulet of kings recovered, and Martin Septim prepared to light the Dragonfires and restore the barrier between worlds, the Mythic Dawn launched their final, desperate gambit. Lanka was defeated, but Mehroonz Daygon himself would now step into Narrated, an event not seen since the First Era. The approach to the Imperial City was fraught with danger. Martin Septim, the champion of Cyrodiil, and a small contingent of blades made their way south from Cloud Ruler Temple through a province ravaged by the Oblivion crisis. The countryside had become nearly unrecognizable in parts, farms abandoned, villages burned, roads patrolled by Daedric creatures rather than Imperial legionnaires. Yet pockets of resistance remained, and as word spread that the last Septim heir was journeying to the Imperial City to end the crisis, hope began to flicker anew in the hearts of Cyrodiil's beleaguered people. As Martin's party neared the Imperial Isle, they could see that the capital had fared better than much of the province. The Imperial Legion had concentrated its forces around the city, creating a defensive perimeter that had thus far prevented any Oblivion gates from opening too close to the walls. The white gold tower still stood unblemished against the sky, its marble surface catching the light as it had for thousands of years. The city itself was in a state of tense preparation. Refugees from outlying areas had swelled the population, filling every available space in the 6 districts surrounding the central palace. The Legion maintained strict rationing of food and water, while healers from the Temple of the One and the various chapel worked tirelessly to care for the wounded and sick. Fear hung in the air like a physical presence, yet alongside it was a grim determination. The Imperial City would not fall without a fight. Martin's arrival caused a stir among both citizens and officials. Many had heard rumors of a hidden heir, but seeing him in person, flanked by blades and accompanied by the now famous champion of Cyrodiil, transformed rumor into reality. High Chancellor Okato, who had been manning the Elder Council in the absence of an emperor, received Martin at the palace with formal ceremony, but genuine relief. After reviewing Martin's claim and the evidence supporting his Septim bloodline, Okato officially recognized him as the legitimate heir to the throne. There was no time for a proper coronation. With the amulet of kings in hand, Martin needed only to reach the Temple of the One and light the Dragonfires to end the Daedric invasion. A procession was hastily arranged. Martin, his closest allies, and an honor guard of Imperial Legion soldiers would move from the palace through the temple district to complete the ritual that would save Tamriel. It was at this moment of highest hope that disaster struck. As the procession reached the temple district, the sky above the Imperial City turned the color of blood. The very air seemed to tear open as reality itself was breached in a way never before witnessed in recorded history. Through this massive rift stepped Mehroonz Daygon himself, not a mere avatar or aspect, but the Daedric prince in his full, terrible glory. Standing taller than the buildings around him, Dagon's forearms wielded massive weapons that could crush stone with a single blow. His skin glowed like cooling lava, cracked in places to reveal the fires burning within. The very ground shook with each step he took deeper into the city, and all who looked upon him felt a primal fear that transcended rational thought. For the first time since the creation of the Dragonfires, a Daedric prince had physically entered Mundus with his full power intact. In the chaos that followed, the carefully planned procession disintegrated. Legion soldiers, despite their training and discipline, broke ranks at the sight of a being whose very existence defied mortal comprehension. Citizens who had lined the streets to glimpse their new emperor now fled in terror, seeking any shelter from the apocalypse that had literally walked into their city. The temple district, moments before an orderly space prepared for an imperial ceremony, became a scene of panic and destruction, as Daygon's massive form crushed buildings and scattered debris with casual movements. Amidst this chaos, Martin Septim remained focused on his purpose. Surrounded by a rapidly dwindling group of protectors, he fought his way toward the Temple of the One. Now in the shadow of Mehroonz, Daygon himself, the champion of Cyrodiil, cleared a path through both panicked citizens and Daedric adversaries, enabling Martin to reach the temple doors. Once inside the circular chamber, Martin made a devastating realization. The ritual of lighting the Dragonfires required that the barriers between worlds be intact enough to be reinforced. With Mehroonz's Dagon physically present in Mundus, those barriers had been not just weakened but shattered. The traditional means of ending the crisis was now impossible. In this moment of apparent defeat, with the sounds of destruction echoing through the temple walls, Martin Septim demonstrated why he, of all the Septim line, was perhaps best suited to face this unprecedented threat. Drawing on his background as both priest of Akatosh and scholar of Daedric lore, Martin perceived a solution where others saw only doom. The Amulet of Kings was more than a symbol of imperial authority. It contained the divine essence of Akatosh himself, gathered over centuries of the covenant with the Septim bloodline. This power could be released, Martin reasoned, through an act of supreme sacrifice. As Daygon began to tear the roof from the Temple of the One, Martin shared a final moment with the champion of Cyrodiil, a few words of gratitude and farewell before stepping into the center of the chamber. There, with Daygon looming above and the fate of all Nirn hanging in the balance, Martin Septim shattered the Amulet of Kings, the ancient gem carried by every Septim emperor since Elessir, broke apart in a blinding flash of light. Its divine power, no longer contained within crystalline boundaries, flowed into the last of the Septim bloodline. What followed transcended mortal understanding. Martin's physical form was consumed in flames of gold and white, not flames of destruction, but of transformation. Where the heir to the ruby throne had stood moments before, now towered a massive dragon of pure divine essence, the avatar of Akatosh, manifest in the mortal world. The battle between the avatar of Akatosh and Mehroonz Daygon was both brief and eternal. Two fundamental forces of reality, the divine time god of order and the Daedric prince of destruction, clashed in the heart of the imperial city. Buildings crumbled around them as their struggle transcended physical limitations. Witnesses later described impossible phenomena, time seeming to flow backward and forward simultaneously, stone turning to gold and back again, flames that froze rather than burned. Ultimately, the power of Akatosh prevailed. The avatar seized Mehroonz Daygon in its massive jaws and tore him from the fabric of Mundus, casting the Prince of Destruction back into oblivion. Then, With a roar that was heard across Tamriel, the Avatar unleashed a wave of divine energy that swept across the world, sealing the barriers between Mundus and Oblivion more permanently than the Dragonfires ever had. As this final act completed, the Avatar of Akatosh underwent one last transformation. Its form, still draconic, but now rigid, turned to stone, creating a massive statue in the center of the Temple of the One. The statue's head remained lifted skyward, its wings outspread in a gesture of both protection and triumph. Martin Septim, the last of the Septim bloodline, was gone, his essence merged with Akatosh in the ultimate sacrifice. The immediate aftermath was one of stunned silence. Those who had witnessed the battle, including the champion of Cyrodiil and High Chancellor Okata, emerged from whatever shelter they had found to behold the new statue and the conspicuous absence of Mehroonz Daygon. Across Cyrodiil, and indeed all Tamriel, Oblivion gates closed simultaneously, their fiery portals collapsing as the reinforced barriers between worlds reasserted themselves. The Oblivion crisis was over. The cost had been immense. Entire communities had been wiped from the map. Thousands had died in Daedric attacks, or as refugees fleeing the invasion. The imperial succession was broken, with no Septim heir to assume the Ruby Throne. The Amulet of Kings, perhaps the most significant magical artifact in imperial history, was destroyed, and Martin Septim, who might have been one of the greatest emperors in Tamriel's history, had sacrificed his very existence before ever being formally crowned. Yet amidst this devastation, hope quickly took root. The sudden closure of all Oblivion gates was immediately recognized as a sign that something fundamental had changed. As the champion of Cyrodiil and High Chancellor Okata shared the news of Martin's sacrifice and the defeat of Mehroonz Daygon, a wave of emotions swept through the imperial city and beyond, grief for what had been lost, mixed with profound relief and gratitude for their deliverance. The physical reconstruction began almost immediately. The damage to the imperial city, while significant in the temple district, was repairable. The white gold tower had remained untouched, and the imperial palace continued to function under Okato's leadership. Throughout Cyrodiil, communities began the slow process of rebuilding homes, restoring farms, and reconnecting trade routes that had been severed by the crisis. The political reconstruction proved more challenging. For the first time in over 400 years, the empire found itself without a Septim emperor. The Elder Council, led by High Chancellor Okata, assumed temporary governance, but questions of long-term succession remained unresolved. Some advocated for a return to the system that had preceded Tiber Septim's rule, with the Elder Council serving as the permanent governing body. Others argued for selecting a new imperial family from among the noble houses of Cyrodiil. This period of uncertainty would eventually lead to the Storm-Crown interregnum and the rise of the Med dynasty. But in the immediate aftermath of the crisis, such concerns seemed secondary to the more fundamental transition that had occurred. The metaphysical relationship between Mundus and Oblivion had been altered in ways that theologians and magical scholars would debate for generations. The covenant established by Saint Alessia, which had required the lighting of the Dragonfires by a dragonborn emperor wearing the Amulet of Kings, had been replaced by something new and different. The divine power of Akatosh, once contained within the amulet and channeled through the Septim bloodline, now manifested permanently in the barrier between worlds. No longer would the death of an emperor create a period of vulnerability to Daedric invasion. The protection was constant, sustained by the sacrifice that had created it. This new reality had profound implications for imperial theology. The direct connection between divine protection and imperial authority had been severed While the empire continued and would eventually find a new ruling dynasty, the metaphysical foundation of imperial legitimacy had changed forever. Some scholars saw this as a democratization of divine protection. Akatosh now shielded all mortals equally, regardless of who sat upon the ruby throne. For the common people of Tamriel, the most visible symbol of this new covenant was the dragon statue in the Temple of the One. The temple itself was rebuilt around the statue rather than removing or relocating it, creating a unique sacred space that honored both Akatosh and Martin Septim's sacrifice. It quickly became a site of pilgrimage, with visitors from across the continent coming to pay homage. Many reported unusual experiences in the presence of the statue, a sense of peace and protection that transcended ordinary religious feeling. Some claimed to hear whispers that sounded like Martin's voice, offering comfort or guidance. Others described dreams in which a golden dragon and a humble priest appeared together, assuring them that the barriers between worlds would hold fast. Whether such experiences represented genuine spiritual phenomena or merely the psychological response to trauma and deliverance, they became an important part of how the people of Tamriel processed what had occurred. Martin Septim, never crowned, never officially emperor, became venerated in popular culture and religious practice as the emperor who never was, or more commonly, the Dragon Emperor. In the years that followed, as Tamriel slowly recovered from the Oblivion crisis, the legend of Martin Septim grew. Bards composed ballads about his journey from humble priest to imperial savior. Artists created paintings and tapestries depicting key moments from his brief time as heir, particularly his final transformation. Writers produced histories and fictional accounts of his life, often embellishing the limited facts available with romantic or heroic elements. Even in provinces that had traditionally resisted imperial authority, Martin's story resonated. The selflessness of his final act transcended political boundaries, speaking to universal values of sacrifice and protection. In Morrowind, still recovering from the eruption of Red Mountain, prayers to both Akatosh and Martin became common among displaced Dunmer. In Black Marsh, traditionally suspicious of imperial figures, Argonian shamans incorporated elements of Martin's transformation into their own spiritual practices. Perhaps the most lasting impact of the Oblivion crisis and its resolution was the reminder it provided of the thin veil separating the mundane from the divine. For a brief but pivotal moment, that veil had been torn aside, revealing both the terrible threat that lurked beyond mortal reality and the sublime power that protected it. Ordinary citizens who had previously given little thought to metaphysical matters now found themselves contemplating the nature of reality itself. In this contemplation lay both vulnerability and strength. The people of Tamriel could no longer pretend that their world existed in isolation, safe from extra-dimensional threats. Yet neither could they doubt that forces of protection and preservation stood watch alongside those of destruction and chaos. The shattered amulet of kings had given way to a new covenant, one forged not through political authority, but through willing sacrifice. As the third era gave way to the fourth, as new threats emerged and new heroes rose to meet them, the legacy of Martin Septim and the Oblivion crisis remained a touchstone for all of Tamriel. The last of the Septims had fallen, but in his fall had come a rebirth, not just of imperial protection, but of the understanding that sometimes the greatest victories come not through conquest or power, but through the willing surrender of both. And so ends the first chapter of our journey through the lore of Elder Scrolls, Oblivion Remastered. The Septim dynasty, which had ruled Tamriel for over 400 years, came to its end with Martin's sacrifice. The Dragonfires would never be lit again, yet Nerd remained protected from the forces of Oblivion by a new covenant, one sealed with the blood of the last Septim. As the embers of our fire grow dim, I hope these tales have transported you to another world, a world of both darkness and light, of terrible threats and valiant heroes. In our next gathering, we will explore the realms beyond Nur, the 16 planes of Oblivion and the Daedric princes who rule them. Until then, may your dreams be peaceful and your rest deep. Thank you for joining me tonight. Wanderers and dreamers, sleep well.